I walked into my own house and realized I had become a ghost. That's the only way I can explain what happened when I opened the door to my apartment in Houston, that moment when I'd been at the grocery distribution center for 12 hours sorting inventory and checking shipments, and my body was moving, but my mind was already gone, already somewhere else, already accepting that the price I'd paid for 5 years wasn't actually worth the purchase I'd made. My husband Marcus was tangled across our living room sofa with a woman in a dress I recognized instantly. Not because it was special, because I had saved for 7 months to buy it. 7 months of budgeting the grocery store salary I'd accepted to keep my life small and humble and separate from everything I used to be. The woman didn't move when she saw me. She pressed closer to Marcus and made this cooing sound, this almost baby talk noise, saying something about how I was dripping everywhere, and wasn't I ruining the hardwood they just refinished? My heartbeat went absolutely still. Not elevated still, complete silence in my chest. I can see it clearly, even now, years later. The way her hand rested on his chest. The way Marcus didn't even glance at me. The way her name was Sienna, looked right through me like I was a maid who'd interrupted her evening instead of the wife who paid for that sofa. And I asked her to leave my house. Politely. I was so polite. Looking back, that politeness is almost harder to remember than what came next. Because it meant I still thought politeness mattered. Still thought that if I was reasonable enough, careful enough, quiet enough, the universe would recognize my effort and reward it. That was my catastrophic mistake. Marcus got up, not to come to me, to get in my face, to tell me, while Sienna watched with genuine curiosity, like I was a reality TV drama unfolding for her personal entertainment, that a woman like me, plain, ungraceful, lacking any real presence, wasn't even worth the shoe leather on her feet. He said I should apologize to her. He said Sienna had done me a service by finally demonstrating what real femininity looked like. I stood there, and something in me wasn't cracking, it had already been cracked. Something in me was simply draining out onto the floor like water you've forgotten you were holding. I told him no, I refused. I simply stared at Sienna and refused to perform the humiliation he was orchestrating, and that's when he lost it. Completely, absolutely lost it. He slapped me across the face hard enough that my vision went temporarily white. Then again, and again. 4 more times after that. I felt my mouth fill with blood and tasted copper, and felt my knees give way, and he was still moving, still connecting, still performing a rage that seemed entirely disconnected from me as a person. I had become a surface, something to strike, a target without insides. He grabbed my collar and dragged me toward the front door, screaming that I needed to think about what I'd done wrong, that I should consider my behavior before I dared come back begging forgiveness. Then he opened the door, threw me literally through the doorframe, and I fell into the rain that was coming down so hard, it looked like the sky itself had split open. The door locked behind me. The deadbolt clicked with this final, terrible finality. And through the door, through the wood, I could still hear Sienna laughing. That gentle, delighted laughing like she'd just watched the most entertaining performance and was waiting for the next act to begin. I sat in the mud outside my own house. I was wearing the brown uniform from work. I was soaked completely through. My face was swelling and I could barely see out of one eye. And I was thinking about a conversation I had 5 years earlier, the day I decided to give up everything. Let me be honest with you for a second. If you have ever been told you were supposed to want less because you were given more, if you ever felt guilty for having advantages, for having family, money, or resources or connections that seemed unfair compared to everyone around you, you understand what I did to myself. I came from Houston's oldest money. My father, Walter Sterling, built real estate and development companies that shaped the skyline you can see from I-610. Our family name opened doors that most people didn't even know existed. And I was raised to feel ashamed of that. Not ashamed in a healthy, grounded way. Ashamed in a way that made me want to disappear. By the time I was 19, I was dating Marcus, who worked in construction project management for his father's company. He was handsome, in a way that felt attainable. He wasn't from my world. He didn't know my history. He didn't need anything from me except my presence and my agreement to be smaller than I was. And I convinced myself that was love. That genuine love meant abandoning everything you came from. That if I really cared about someone, I had to prove it by walking away from every advantage, every connection, every door. I literally told my father I was leaving. I said I needed to build a life that was mine, that wasn't propped up by sterling family money, or sterling family names, or sterling family protection. I said I needed to deserve my own happiness. My father tried to stop me. I remember him in his study on a Saturday morning. He was wearing a cardigan, which he only did on weekends, which somehow made it worse that he was upset, and he kept saying that I was making a decision based on a fantasy about what it meant to prove myself. He said real maturity wasn't self-punishment dressed up as independence. But I was 23 and I was absolutely certain I was right. So I walked out and I didn't call him for 5 years. I worked retail and grocery positions. I lived in apartments where the heating didn't work half the year. I said yes to Marcus even when yes meant erasing parts of myself that didn't fit into his vision of who I should be. And I thought that was sacrifice. I thought that was love. Sitting in the mud, tasting blood, hearing Sienna's laughter through my own front door, I finally understood what my father had been trying to tell me. My phone was in my pocket and somehow it still had battery. There was one number saved in it that I hadn't changed or deleted in 5 years, saved only as Dad. Like it was a file I couldn't bring myself to access but also couldn't bring myself to close. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unlock the screen. When he answered, his voice went from quiet and measured to something completely different. Something that sounded like I'd pressed an emergency alarm he'd been waiting 5 years to hear. I choked out 4 words. Dad, it's me, Olivia. The silence lasted 1 second. Maybe less. Then his voice came through the phone at a volume and intensity that made me hold it away from my ear. He was demanding to know who had hurt me, where exactly I was standing. Was I injured? Was anyone coming after me? My father, who I'd spent 5 years running from, was mobilizing an entire world to reach me inside of 40 seconds. He told me not to move. He said help would be 5 minutes away. And I sat on the curb in that thunderstorm, rain streaming down my face, mixing with tears and blood, and I waited. A black Mercedes pulled up exactly 4 minutes later. My father's chief of staff, Derek, got out and wrapped me in his coat without saying a single word. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make me explain. He drove me straight to my father's house in the village enclave, this enormous estate where I grew up, and then spent 5 years pretending never existed. We didn't speak the entire drive. Derek kept the heat on and the radio off, and when we pulled up to the front door, my father was already waiting. He was wearing his silk robe. His hair was uncombed. He looked like I'd pulled him out of sleep or stolen him from some quiet moment he'd been having. And when he saw my face, really saw it, swollen and bruised and bleeding, the entire ruthless businessman that Houston feared just dissolved. He pulled me into an embrace that felt safer than anywhere I'd been in 5 years. He held me like I might disappear. He held me like I'd never been gone at all. We didn't speak about Marcus or about Sienna or about the house or about any of it that first night. My father ran a bath and made sure I had clean clothes and brought me warm tea, and we just sat together in silence while the grandfather clock ticked in the hallway and the storm continued outside. What I didn't understand yet was that silence was communication. It was my father saying, "I have always been here. You were never actually gone. I have been waiting." The next morning, my father made one phone call that changed everything. I was sitting across from him in his study, having slept 12 hours straight for the first time in years. He was in his desk chair, still in his robe, looking at a folder that Derek had prepared. His jaw was tight. His eyes had gone completely cold. I'd seen that expression before. It was the expression he wore when making decisions about commercial buildings, but it had never been pointed at anything that mattered to him personally. When he looked up at me, his face shifted back into tenderness for just a moment. Then he turned to the phone and made the first call. He ordered his head investigator to pull a complete financial dossier on the Whitmore family business. Not Marcus specifically, his entire family operation. He wanted everything. Cash flows, debt structures, lender relationships, contractor relationships, anything questionable, anything that could be leveraged. He said he needed it in 1 hour, and money wasn't a consideration. Then he made a second call to a contractor who was working on the Whitmore's flagship commercial project in downtown Houston. He said there had been critical structural defects discovered, and the project needed to be abandoned immediately. Public statement released before noon. Excuse credible and unchallengeable. He said the contractor worked for him now, and they needed to understand what that meant. By the time we had breakfast, my father had quietly called in favors from people I didn't even know he knew. A federal contact who suddenly found reason to audit several years of the Whitmore Company's books. A loan officer who began restructuring how their credit was being reported. An IRS investigator who'd been waiting years for an excuse to look closely at their financial structure. My father had weaponized his influence like someone who'd been holding a gun and waiting patiently for years for a reason to fire it. And the reason had finally arrived. Here's what I need you to understand. I am not going to tell you that I stopped him. I am not going to tell you I asked him to be gentle or suggested he show mercy. Because I didn't. I sat there eating pancakes that my father's chef had made, and I felt something cold settle into my chest that felt like relief. That felt like justice. That felt like finally, someone was going to hurt the way I'd been hurting. If you have ever been dismissed by someone you loved, if you've ever felt yourself become less real because another person decided you were worth less, you understand why I didn't ask him to stop. I was tired of being small. I was tired of being grateful for scraps. We sat in that study, my father and I, and watched his phone ring as his investigator started sending preliminary findings. Sienna had nearly $100,000 in debt. High interest, predatory lending, the kind of debt that collectors pursue aggressively. This detail stood out to my father. He picked up the phone and ordered those debt collectors to accelerate their timeline. He said he would cover it if they needed resources. That was actually the cruelest part, looking back. He could have left Sienna to her own consequences, but he decided to ensure she experienced them faster. The Whitmore family spent that afternoon and evening having their entire world collapse in real time. My father had orchestrated it so that everything happened simultaneously. There's a psychology to that kind of coordinated destruction when multiple pressures hit at once. A person can't decide which emergency to handle first. There's no hierarchy of crisis. Everything feels equally catastrophic. By evening, the contractors on their flagship project had gone public. The withdrawal statement cited structural issues that couldn't be resolved. The stock market began reflecting the lost contract, before the Whitmores even understood what was happening. Their banks flagged their credit line for immediate recall. Their lenders issued formal default notices. Vendors who'd been extended credit for years suddenly demanded payment in full. And my father watched it happen like he was observing a formula he'd predicted perfectly. He kept saying, "They'll try to call people now. They'll reach out to their network. Watch how fast their network abandons them." And he was right. He was absolutely right. Marcus arrived at the Whitmore Company offices the next morning to find the parking garage blockaded by subcontractors holding signs, screaming that they were owed millions in unpaid invoices. He couldn't get into the building from the garage entrance. When he came around to the front, federal agents in blue windbreakers were standing in the lobby with stacks of paperwork. The IRS was opening a criminal investigation into falsified accounting records dating back 7 years. His father, Charles, was in his office screaming on the phone with lenders. His mother, Dorothy, was sitting on the front steps of their home in Bel Air, their actual home, their personal residence, while process servers, handed her legal documents and courthouse couriers, arrived with bankruptcy filings. Sienna was there that morning, I found out later. She'd stayed the night, thinking she could solidify her position as the loyal girlfriend, the woman who stood by during crisis. She was wearing a dress borrowed from Dorothy's closet. She was holding Dorothy's hand and making sympathetic noises while her own debt collectors were, at that exact moment, arriving to seize her belongings as asset recovery. She had no idea. She was still performing a role that no longer existed. Marcus called me. I didn't pick up. He called 4 more times that day. By the time I answered, on the evening of the second day, he was unraveling. He said someone had sabotaged his entire company. That federal agents were investigating fraud he didn't know existed. His father had been cooking books, apparently, for years. That the company was finished. That our house was going to be seized. That he needed me to come home. That I needed to tell him this was about his family, and that if I called off whatever was happening, he would fix everything. He would throw Sienna out. He would rebuild. He would do whatever I wanted. And I just listened to him breathe on the other end of the line. My father was in the study with Derek, and they both looked at me. I could see in their faces that they already knew what I was going to say. I told Marcus that I needed to attend an event, that I'd talk to him tomorrow. And I hung up. The gala was at the Worthington, the most prestigious hotel in downtown Houston. My father had taken me to similar events when I was younger, before I decided to disappear, and I'd always felt like an imposter in the elaborate gowns and borrowed confidence. This time was different. This time, my father had commissioned a custom dress, something architectural and perfect, something that looked like it had been designed specifically for me to wear. He had me styled by his personal team. He arranged my hair, and when I looked in the mirror, the woman looking back was someone I recognized. Powerful, real, present. We arrived at the gala at 9 o'clock, and the entire room shifted when we entered. My father's reputation preceded him, and I was the mystery, the daughter no one had seen in years, suddenly emerging at his side. Women I didn't know were introducing themselves and saying they'd heard so much about me. Men were studying me carefully, trying to place me in their mental databases of power. I was completely, totally visible for the first time in half a decade. And it felt like breathing after being underwater. Marcus had scraped together an invitation somehow. He was already drunk when he saw me. That's what my father's contact told us later, that Marcus had been drinking steadily since the morning, hoping to find some investor desperate or foolish enough to lend to a sinking company. He was standing near the champagne display, and he just saw me. He saw me walking across the ballroom in a custom gown on my father's arm. He saw the way people were turning to watch me. He saw me exactly as I actually was. The champagne glass he was holding just dropped, literally fell through his hands and shattered on the marble. I felt him approach before I saw him. That's the thing about violence or cruelty from someone you've known intimately. Your body recognizes the person before your conscious mind processes it. My shoulders tensed. My father's arm tightened around mine. And Marcus was there, grabbing my arm, begging me to step into the marble hallway outside the ballroom where he could speak to me privately. I need to slow down here, because this moment is when everything actually resolved in my mind. This moment is when I stopped being the woman who'd been thrown into a storm and became someone completely different. I let him pull me into that hallway. It was nearly empty, just a few servers clearing glasses, a couple of hotel staff. My father let me go, and I walked with Marcus to a corner where we could have something resembling privacy. He was crying, actual tears streaming down his face. He was telling me that I had to fix this, that I had to call off whatever I'd unleashed. He was saying he would give me everything. He would sign over the house immediately. He would divorce Sienna, except wait. We weren't married, were we? I'd never actually married him. I'd just spent 5 years living as his wife without any legal protection. He was promising me things that weren't his to promise, and begging me in a voice that sounded like a child's. And I just looked at him with everything I was feeling perfectly contained inside my own body. I asked him if he'd been thinking about our love while he slapped me 6 times. I asked him if he'd been thinking about me when he threw me into a thunderstorm. I asked him if he'd been thinking about my value when he told me I wasn't even worth the shoes on another woman's feet. I said it all very quietly, very clearly. And then I told him to liquidate whatever assets he had left before his debtors broke more than his windows. I told him goodbye. And I walked back into the ballroom without looking behind me. My father was waiting exactly where I'd left him, holding 2 glasses of champagne like he'd never let me go. He put one in my hand and asked me if I was all right. I said yes. I meant it. We spent the rest of the evening watching people approach my father and then looking at me with new understanding. Understanding that they'd been looking at a woman who mattered all along and hadn't even realized it. What happened after is almost anticlimactic compared to that moment. But it matters for understanding what actually gets destroyed when a system finally catches up with corruption. Marcus went home to find Sienna waiting. She'd heard about the gala. She'd heard that Marcus's wife, except I wasn't his wife, that's the thing, had been there with an extremely powerful man. She was panicking, and when Marcus started screaming at her that her greed had cost him everything, that she'd walked into his marriage and destroyed it, she fought back. They were actually fighting, physically wrestling, when the sheriff's deputies arrived with the court order to seize her personal property as collateral for her debt. I heard about this later, secondhand, but I can picture it. Sienna watching deputies haul out designer bags. Sienna understanding that she was never going to be the lady of the Whitmore house. Sienna realizing that her bet on Marcus as a stepping stone had dissolved beneath her feet while she was still standing on it. And then she just left. Walked out into the night with nothing but a broken heel and whatever was in her purse. Just abandoned the entire story she'd been writing for herself. Marcus's father, Charles, had a heart attack when the federal indictment was unsealed. Then a second one when he realized that his decades-long history of financial manipulation was about to be public record and that his son was implicated equally. Charles died in a hospital bed, and I felt absolutely nothing when my father told me. This is something I had to work through later in therapy, this terrible, complex. Nothing that I felt about someone whose corruption had enabled years of cruelty toward me, but at the time, it was just information. Another consequence. Another piece of the world adjusting itself to match reality instead of his version of reality. The Whitmore Company was liquidated in bankruptcy court. Every asset was converted to liquid value. Every contract was dissolved. Every employee had to find new work. And my father, because he is the kind of man who doesn't do things halfway, made sure that I was offered the opportunity to purchase the suburban house, the one where I'd been thrown into the mud at the foreclosure auction. For pennies. For less than anyone else would pay. I made the purchase. Not because I wanted to live there, not because I wanted to erase the memory, but because I wanted to own the ground I'd been discarded on. I wanted the deed in my name. I wanted to stand in that house knowing that I could burn it down tomorrow if I wanted to, and the only consequence would be my own choice. That's what ownership actually means, not the thing itself, but the power to choose what happens to it. When you've spent 5 years powerless, that's an almost erotic kind of freedom. But here's what my father helped me understand, and here's the lesson that actually matters. I didn't transform my life because I destroyed Marcus's. I transformed my life because I finally believed that I was allowed to exist as my full self. And those are two completely different things that sometimes feel the same in the moment, but aren't actually related at all. With part of my inheritance because my father, once I was back in his world, made sure I was fully back in his world, financially and legally and completely. I established the Sterling Foundation for Survivor Support. We provide legal representation for women leaving abusive relationships. We offer emergency housing. We offer financial grants to cover the gap between when someone leaves and when they find stability. We hire investigators to document abuse for custody cases. We help women reconstruct their lives without needing a powerful father with a private helicopter and years of financial resources to make it happen. Because here's what I understood. Most women don't have what I have. Most women don't have parents who can literally dismantle an empire in 48 hours. Most women don't have family money or family connections or the safety net that comes from being born into a world that will catch you if you fall. Most women have to fight, quietly and alone, for every single piece of dignity and protection that should have been guaranteed to them from the beginning. Every dollar we give out, every legal case we fight, every woman we shelter, that's my actual revenge. Not the destruction of Marcus's world, the building of something better, the insistence that no woman should have to choose between safety and poverty, between leaving and homelessness, between breaking free and losing everything. Years later, I heard that Marcus had been released from prison after serving time for fraud, conspiracy, and tax evasion. He was working construction day labor, supporting an aging mother who'd lost everything in the collapse with him. I had no feeling about this. None. That was the actual freedom, not gloating over his fall, but being so thoroughly past it that his suffering registered as just another thing that happened in the world. He ceased to matter to me, not in an angry way, just in a complete, total absence of significance. Sienna was somewhere in the city, from what I could gather, still trying to rebuild, probably still owing money, probably still convinced that she was close to the life she'd convinced herself she deserved. I thought about her rarely. When I did, I felt something like sadness, because she'd also been a victim of a system that taught her that the only way to be secure was to attach yourself to someone else's power. She'd made a different choice than I did, but it came from the same desperate framework. The thing that actually undid me happened on a completely ordinary day. It was winter, actually, and I was in my office. The foundation had grown much larger by that point. We had staff and programs in 3 cities, and my father called just to ask what I wanted for dinner. There was no reason for it. There was no crisis brewing. He just called to ask me what I wanted to eat. And I completely fell apart. I cried at my desk for 20 minutes because of a question about dinner. Because someone who loved me was checking in on what would nourish me. Because for 5 years, I'd convinced myself that this was weak, that accepting care meant I hadn't earned my independence. And now I understood that receiving love from someone who chooses to give it is actually the strongest thing a person can do. It takes infinitely more courage to let someone take care of you than to prove you can survive without them. The sweetest thing about my so-called revenge wasn't the destruction at all. It was this: The life I built once the rage settled. A life where I don't hate Marcus anymore. A life where I don't think about Sienna at all unless she appears in some news story I'm scrolling through. A life where my power comes from what I choose to build, not from what I destroyed. A life where my father asks me what I want for dinner, and I get to tell him, and he listens. And it's ordinary and boring and absolutely perfect. The woman who knelt in the mud 5 years ago, desperate and silent, and convinced she deserved whatever was happening to her, that woman is gone. Not erased, not forgotten, but genuinely, completely gone. She's been replaced by someone who understands that love should never require you to become smaller. Love should never require 6 slaps to prove itself. Love should never ask you to abandon every advantage you have in order to demonstrate that you're grateful. Real love makes you bigger. Real love brings you home. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been in a room and felt yourself disappearing, if you know what it's like to try to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, did you think I made the right choice about Marcus? Would you have done the same thing if you had the power I had? Or would you have shown mercy in a situation where mercy wasn't actually possible? Also, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Are you at work, at home, about to sleep? I'd love to know that I'm reaching real people in real moments. And if you have your own story, if you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever loved someone who didn't deserve it, if you've ever had to rebuild yourself from nothing, tell me in the comments. Tell me what you chose. Tell me what happened next. Because the only thing that heals me more than building the foundation is knowing that this story helps other people feel less alone in their own rage, less isolated in their own survival. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Because I'm uploading a brand new narrative every single week. Stories of women who fought back. Stories of people who chose themselves. Stories of the quiet moments that matter more than we could ever explain. You won't want to miss what comes next. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.